Hello and welcome back to my channel. If you're new, welcome. Today we're going to be talking about a case from a country that has fascinated me since I was a child, which is India. And yes, I have been there. I had a great time and I'm definitely going to go back sometime. But before we get started, we're going to be talking about two different topics that are often very triggering for people, and that is domestic violence and suicide. So if you don't want to hear about either of those things right now, please go ahead and click out of the video. And with that being said, I will go ahead and get started. This case is essentially a tale of extreme selfishness and greed. It's a very recent case and it was widely reported on in the Indian media, but I wanted to compile all the information that's out there about it and put it into one video so that people could get the full story if they wanted to. The ruling in this case amounts to 441 pages, and I went through all of them so that I could bring you the full story. And also, if you've been watching my channel and enjoying it, I would really love it if you could subscribe. It would really help me out, and also that way you won't miss the next video. India is a huge country with almost 1.4 billion people. India is made up of 28 states and 8 union territories. It's a very culturally and religiously diverse society, and there are actually 447 languages spoken in India. So today we're going to be talking about a young woman named Vismaya S.V. Nair. Vismaya was born in the late 1990s in Kollam, Kerala, India. Believe it or not, I actually could not find an exact birth date for her. A lot of news sources reported her birth year as 1996. However, I actually think that it was 1997 or 98. At the time that this happened, her brother gave a TV interview and he referred to her as age 23, unlike a lot of news reports which say age 24. And I trust her brother, so I'm going to go with what he said and say that she was 23 years old when this happened in 2021, which again would make her birth year 1997 or 98. Now, Kerala is a state in India, and it's all the way down at the southern tip of India on what is called the Malabar coast. Kerala is the home of Keralites, also known as Malayalis, and that's an ethnic group. Kerala has a very high GDP and a very low poverty rate. It actually has one district that has a poverty rate of 0%, which is just amazing. Kerala is very beautiful, and it's also known as God's own country, and the reason for that has to do with Hindu mythology, which I am most certainly not an expert in. But apparently the mythology is that one of the incarnations of Lord Vishnu, who was called Lord Parasurama, threw an axe across the sea to create a new land for his devotees where they could live in peace. And that land is Kerala. Vismaya had an older brother named Vijith, and they were very close, and they often made these really cute TikToks together. As you can see, Vismaya seems to be a very bubbly, happy, energetic girl. And her family called her Malu. That was one of her nicknames. Their father's name is Thrivikraman Nair, and their mother is Sajitha Nair. Their father, Thrivikraman, actually worked in Saudi Arabia for 25 years, where he managed a grocery store. And this is very common among the Keralites. A lot of them live in the Gulf states. And in fact, in 2008, there were 2.5 million of them living there. Vismaya's brother Vijay said that Vismaya was an active and bold girl and was one of the most popular girls in her school. She had lots of friends and some interesting hobbies. One of the things she liked to do was something I absolutely love, which is classical South Indian dance. And she was also in the National Cadet Corps, which is the youth branch of the armed forces in India. In fact, Vismaya was actually a national level junior under officer, which is a rank that's only given to the most successful performers. Vismaya went to college to become an Ayurvedic doctor, and her degree was what they call BAMS, which is Bachelor of Ayurvedic Medicine and Surgery. And while she was in college, Vismaya started thinking about getting married, and she actually made a really cute TikTok video about this. You may already know this, but in India, something called arranged marriage is very common. Actually, 90% of Indian marriages are arranged. So in an arranged marriage, it's often like each family has a list of traits that they want for their son or daughter, and they look for potential matches who have those traits. Usually there's family involvement, but sometimes the profile is run by the prospective bride or groom, which was the case here. Vismaya was managing her own matrimonial profile. So usually in an arranged marriage, the families talk to each other and they try to determine if it would be a good match. There are also horoscopes involved. They have something called Manglik, which are the very unlucky horoscope people. And I was watching a documentary about this one time, and they were talking about how these Mongolic people were so cursed and their lives were just absolutely terrible. And I felt so badly for them. And then I looked it up, and guess who's a Mongolic? That would be me. As I'm talking about these topics in India, please keep in mind that not everyone does things the same way. India is a very diverse country, like I mentioned. I was there for 2 weeks and I met all kinds of different people. I met people who were really passionate about painting and animals, and people who were single well into their 40s, and people who were single parents, and people who had had traditional marriages, and people who had had love marriages. A love marriage would be like what we have in the West, where people fall in love and they get married. That's like 10% of marriages in India. So please just keep that in mind. We don't want to generalize about anything. So anyway, with arranged marriage, the families will speak to each other, see if they think it's a good match, and then the couple will meet each other, and they may only meet once or a couple of times. Occasionally they actually don't meet at all, and then they agree to get married. And they have this concept that you won't love the person at first because you don't know them yet, but you will grow to love them over time. So you may be wondering how a person would locate a prospective bride or groom, and there are lots of options for this. So of course there's good old-fashioned family or friend networking. Sometimes a relative knows someone that they think would be perfect for that person. They put ads in newspapers. They have marriage bureaus, and they also have apps. They have matrimonial apps that people have on their phones or on their computers, and they make a profile and look at other people's profiles. There are all kinds of ways to do this, and like I said, in this case, Vismaya was actually running her own matrimonial profile. In September 2019, Vismaya got engaged to a boy that she met on a matrimonial website. He was about 7 years older than her, and his name was Kiran Kumar. Now, Kiran was considered quite the hot commodity on the dating market. And that's because he was very well educated and he had a government job, which is very prestigious in India. So he was an assistant motor vehicle inspector for the state of Kerala. He had gotten that job at the age of 28, and it made him a very eligible bachelor. And given all those factors, Vismaya's family approved of him, and he was considered a great catch. They actually had an engagement party with over 900 guests. Now, in India, they have something called dowry. And again, not everyone practices this, but it is very prevalent. Dowry is a practice in which the bride's family gives the groom's family gifts when the couple gets married. Some of the most common dowry items that are given are household appliances, bedding, cars, jewelry, and of course, cash or gold. And as you can see, dowry puts a huge strain on the bride's family. Now, dowry has actually been illegal in India since 1961, but that doesn't stop people from practicing it, and it's practiced all over India among people from every religious group. The amount of dowry varies by region, but regardless, imagine that you're a normal working family and you have daughters, and you have to come up with all this extra money to give when they get married. It's just a huge financial burden. But having said that, in some families where they have a little bit more money, giving a large dowry is kind of a status symbol. And that seems to be more the case here. Most historians don't believe that there's a long tradition of dowry in India. In fact, there are journals from someone who worked for Alexander the Great that talks specifically about how Indian people do not practice dowry because it was practiced by other cultures. It seems that dowry became a thing in the 20th century, and over the decades, the amount of dowry just got higher and higher. It's called dowry inflation, and that was most certainly the case in Kerala, where there has been major dowry inflation since the 1970s. Families with sons will often use dowry to expand their wealth and get ahead financially. And sometimes the family will have very specific demands about what they want. So you're introducing this huge financial incentive for a boy to get married. So sometimes what will happen is a couple will get engaged and the groom's family has all these requests or demands for dowry. They might want cars, cash, stuff for their houses, jewelry. And if the bride's family doesn't produce those things, sometimes the groom will basically harass and torture his new wife just to try to get more dowry out of her family. And sometimes this even leads to the bride getting killed, which is called a dowry death. This is a huge problem in India, and the government tried to fix it by passing this law that said that if a bride's family reported dowry harassment, the groom and his family would all get arrested. But this law was widely abused, and so the Supreme Court overturned it. A lot of the time, the specifics of dowry are not outlined, and so you can see how this would be a problem when there are different expectations from each side. So sometimes the families will send a distant relative or a friend or even something called a marriage broker to discuss this issue with both families before they go through with the marriage so that there are not any misunderstandings about this. And if there's too much divide between their expectations, they can call off the wedding ahead of time. So this boy, Kieran, was harboring all kinds of wild fantasies about all this dowry that he was going to get on the marriage market because of his government job. According to Vismaya's mother, Kieran's family had a specific demand for dowry, and they decided to give them 100 sovereigns of gold, which I had no idea what a sovereign of gold was, but it's about $44,000 worth of gold. Altogether, plus a car, plus 1.2 acres of land. So I don't know about you all, but where I'm from, if your in-laws gifted you $44,000 worth of gold and a car and some land, I mean, most people would be totally over the moon about that. I read one statistic that said the average dowry in Kerala is actually under $400. I'm not sure if that's right, but if it is, that means that this dowry that they were going to give Kieran was just far and away outrageously, astronomically above the norm. According to Vismaya's father, the family didn't have a specific demand for dowry. On May 31st, 2020, right in the middle of the COVID pandemic, Vismaya married Kieran at her family's house. And of course, Vismaya was feeling optimistic. She felt like she had gotten a great catch and her life was going to be happy. But unfortunately, that was the day that her life turned into an absolute living hell. You see, the first thing that happened was that on their wedding night, Kieran saw the car that Vismaya's father had purchased for them for the first time. And it was a Toyota Yaris. And Kieran was just not satisfied with this. He really wanted a more expensive and fancier car that supposedly would get better gas mileage. Now, the Toyota Yaris was almost $14,000, and Vismaya's father bought it brand new and he financed it. He had to take out a loan for it. But it just wasn't good enough for Kieran, who started complaining about it that very night. One reason that Vismaya's father bought this car was that Vismaya really loved this car. She wanted it, but it wasn't good enough, and she told her father that, and he said, okay, we'll get a better car as soon as I figure out the financing on the Yaris. And remember, this is during the pandemic, so everything was kind of up in the air. Businesses were closed. It was just total societal change. I'm sure we all remember this. Society was not really operating normally at that time. Traditionally, Indian brides go and live with their groom's family after they get married, and that's how you end up with wedding pictures that look like this. This is kind of a tradition, having a photo of the bride crying at her wedding, and it's supposed to represent the sadness they feel because they're leaving their family home for the first time, the comfortable place where they grew up with their parents who love them and care about them, and now they have to learn a whole new way of life with their in-laws and adjust to their ways. Now, of course, in modern India, there are lots of women who have already lived on their own when they get married, but in Vismaya's case, this was actually true. She was leaving her parents' home for the first time. So in the beginning, Vismaya thought things were going to be fine because her father was going to buy them a different car, and she hung on to hope that things were going to get better with Kieran and everything was going to be okay. In fact, here's a video of them dancing together a few days after they got married. And you can see how normal and happy they look. But the next week, Kieran went to the bank to open a bank locker, which I believe is called a bank deposit box in the United States. And he was going to deposit those 100 sovereigns of gold in it. But the bank cross-checked how many there were, and it turned out that there were only 80 sovereigns, not 100. And so the amount of gold was actually only about $35,000 instead of $44,000. So it turned out, because of lockdown, Vismaya's father was not able to get the remaining 20 sovereigns, which is why it was short. Kieran went ballistic when he heard this, and he started yelling at Vismaya, saying that he had been deceived, and he was just totally upset about this. And those two things together, the car thing plus being shorted 20 sovereigns of gold, was just a horrendous combination for Kieran, and he was just super angry about this. So, of course, Kieran started taking his anger out on Vismaya. Vismaya's brother's fiance, whose name is Dr. Revathi, noticed that Vismaya was not the same. She was much sadder. She was not her former bubbly, happy self. And so she asked Vismaya what was wrong, and she told her that Kieran was physically and mentally abusing her for bringing, quote, meager dowry, and he was also body shaming her, and he also called her Supandi. Supandi is a character in a children's magazine in India called Tinkle. It used to be a monthly magazine, now I think they publish it twice a month, but anyway, Supandi is basically a stupid village simpleton. So that's how he was referring to his new wife. Dr. Revathi advised Vismaya not to hide any of this and to be honest and open with her parents about it. Dr. Revathi did all she could do, which was give Vismaya a phone number to call for domestic violence victims, but Vismaya never called the number. On August 27th, 2020, so less than 4 months after they'd gotten married, apparently Kieran held Vismaya up against a wall, pulled her hair, then she fell down on the floor and he started stomping on her face. This was Vismaya's newlywed life. And very soon after that, they were out clothes shopping, and Kieran got angry again in the car and started beating Vismaya up on the way home from their shopping. And Vismaya actually opened the door and got out of the car and ran to a complete stranger's house, sobbing. She stood outside this person's gate, and this person came out of her house, and so did other people. The woman whose house it was named Shyla. And Vismaya told Shyla and these other neighbors of hers that Kieran had beaten her up in the car. So she ended up calling her dad, and her dad called Kieran, and Kieran was very rude to Vismaya's dad, even though he promised him that he would transfer him the remaining 20 gold sovereigns as soon as he could once they got out of lockdown, or once that kind of banking was allowed during lockdown. But this just wasn't good enough for Kieran, and he was just still incredibly angry. According to Vismaya's father, Kieran's father was also demanding dowry, so it wasn't just Kieran. Vismaya sent messages to her family about this. She said that Kieran was beating her up and he was very unhappy and was taking his anger out on her. She would also call her mother and tell her that Kieran had been beating her, and apparently one time he hit her so hard in the mouth that she was bleeding. And at first, I think Vismaya's mother was trying to get her to come home, but Vismaya was really afraid of social blame and being embarrassed in her community, so she really didn't want to do that. One of the most unique things about this case is that for some reason, both Vismaya and Kieran were recording their phone calls, and I don't know why, but as a result, there are all these phone call recordings, and some of them are out there on YouTube. I have to warn you, they're very distressing, so I'm not going to play them for you here. But in one of them, Vismaya calls her father, and she says, "If I'm forced to live here, you will not see me again. I will do something. I cannot bear it anymore. Father, I want to come back." And she's just absolutely sobbing as she's saying this. And her father says, "Okay, you come back. There's no problem. Just come back home." And she says, "I'm scared. I'm being beaten. He told me to leave the house." And her father says, "He's just saying that in anger, child. That is how life is." And she says, I'm scared. I can't go on like this." In the early hours of January 3rd, 2021, Kieran and Vismaya were at Vismaya's parents' house. And apparently Kieran got drunk and started hitting Vismaya right there in front of her family and in front of their neighbors, which you can see the abuse is escalating. And Vismaya's brother Vijith tried to step in and stop Kieran, but he actually got Vijith down on the ground. He must have been really strong because Vijith is a pretty big guy. So their parents were awakened because Vismaya was crying and wailing. So as Vismaya's dad comes out Kieran gets up from Vijith's body and says this: "No one should feel comfort after burdening me with a scrap car and a waste female. The future course will be decided only after the exchange of the assets promised." He actually tells Vismaya's father, "You don't have a right to speak until you give me the rest of this money and gold and get me a different car. And until then, your daughter and car are going to stay here." Then he takes off the gold chain that Thrivikraman had given him and throws it at him and runs off. So then, of course, Vismaya's parents call the police and they go and find him, which didn't take very long. So they tell the police what happened, that Kieran had been beating Vismaya. Meanwhile, Vijith was so badly off that he had to go to 3 different hospitals. Ultimately, he ended up being okay. But I mean, Vijith had a lot of medical symptoms. He had a headache, he had chest pain, he was vomiting and sweating, and he also had pain in his right knee and one of his upper arms. But ultimately, he was okay, and he came home a few hours later. So somehow, one of Kieran's colleagues heard about this and came over to the house, and he told the family that if they pressed charges against Kieran, he might lose his government job. And so that was why the family decided to let this go. So here you can see that this family was valuing their son-in-law's job, their abusive son-in-law who's beating their daughter all the time. They're valuing his job over her safety and their safety. And Vismaya is more afraid of social blame and what the neighbors think than she is afraid of her own husband who's beating her. But remember, Vismaya is very young at this point. She's only about 23, very young, not much life experience, and I think a lot of people her age would be in the same position. So unfortunately, the next day, Vismaya decided to go back to Kieran's house and live with him and his family again. And her dad tried to get her to come back home, and she wouldn't. And a week later, her parents went over to Kieran's house to invite the family to Vijith's wedding, which was going to happen on February 8th. And I don't know exactly what Vismaya's parents saw here, but it became really apparent to them what was going on and how their daughter was being abused in this house. So they actually took her home with them, and neither Kieran nor his parents went to Vijith's wedding. So during this time that she was away from Kieran, Vismaya started telling her family more details about what was happening, and she started telling them that she was feeling suicidal. She was actually so desperate for help that she contacted a mentalist, which would be called a psychic in the US. So they set up a meeting, and Vismaya told this psychic that she was having trouble concentrating on school. But when he kind of pressed her further, she told him that she was being beaten at home by her husband. And she told him the whole dowry harassment story. The court documents don't say how the mentalist responded to this, but again, it just shows how desperate she was. In another instance, she was messaging one of her friends on WhatsApp and telling the friend that she was desperate to get out, she was being beaten, she was scared, and so on. And the friend told her to wait because Kerala was in triple lockdown. And I don't know if you recall this, but that was one of the big criticisms about lockdowns in general all over the world, was that they were going to enable domestic violence. So while she was staying there with her family, her parents came up with a plan to get her out of this, and that plan was called divorce. Their position was that this would be better for both of them because Vismaya wouldn't be tortured over dowry anymore, and Kieran would still be able to go out on the marriage market and get a new dowry and get all the possessions and money and car that he was looking for. And in fact, they went as far as to set up a mediation meeting which was supposed to take place on March 25th, 2021. But on March 17th, Vismaya was at school, and Kieran picked her up and took her home with him. That also happened to be Kieran's birthday, So I'm not sure if he kind of used that to guilt trip her into coming back with him or what, but she did. Now, there's a very disturbing phone call that's also on YouTube between Kieran and his brother-in-law, whose name is Mukesh. And the two of them are scheming about how to get a better car out of Vismaya's father. Mukesh says this: "We will say she had an affair. What else to say? We will say that when we found out about the affair, they accused us of asking for dowry. We will make up a story like that, as if we don't know how to make up stories. We can just nicely say that. What else can we do? We have been shamed anyway. You do not have to talk anymore. Drop her at college tomorrow if she asks. Be careful if you're taking her on the bike. If she jumps, they will say you pushed her." So 2 days after she went back to Kieran's house, she called her dad and she told him that the reason Kieran wanted her back was not because he loved her, but because he was afraid of getting in trouble over what happened on January 3rd. You know, the night when he was beating her in front of her parents and family and also beat up her brother. Vismaya's father had no idea that this would be the last time that he would speak to his daughter. So during this time, Kieran's abuse did not improve. It actually got worse. He was still beating Vismaya, putting her down, body shaming her, and he even locked her out of the house one time, which she told Vijith about. And he actually blocked all of her family on her phone. And I don't know exactly why she couldn't unblock them. I guess he was probably monitoring her phone all the time. So he blocked all of her relatives except for her mom. And she wasn't really supposed to call her mom either, but she still did this when Kieran wasn't around. But one time, she was talking to her mom, and he walked in the door and grabbed the phone out of Vismaya's hand and starts yelling at her mom, telling her to stop talking to Vismaya. However, this did not stop them from talking, because Vismaya made many more phone calls to her mom. In April 2021, she told her mom that some specific people she knew had made fun of her during the time that she had moved back in with her parents temporarily, and that's why she didn't want to do it again. She didn't want to hear it from them. And in another call in April, she tells her mom that Kieran had been beating her again, and the reason was that she actually reached out to her sister-in-law's brother, again, probably desperately trying to get some help, and Kieran found out about it, and that was his excuse to beat her. She told her mom that she regretted getting back with Kieran, it was a mistake she made, and she was even afraid that Kieran might kill her. And again, she talks about the social ridicule, and again she says, "I will do something, Mom." And apparently during this time, she was also refusing to eat. So there are several more phone calls, and Vismaya begs her mother to send Kieran the rest of the money because she thinks that this is going to stop if she does that, and it's the only way he's going to stop. And she even sent her mom pictures of where Kieran had beaten her. This is so frustrating, but her mom at this point kept telling her to stay. She said that suicide was not the answer and the difficulties in life were to be faced. Vismaya again told her mom there was absolutely no way she could live here like this unless they sent the rest of the money, and she even asked her mother if she were a valueless commodity. On Vismaya's 1-year wedding anniversary on May 31st, 2021, she actually did not spend it with her husband. She spent it with her childhood friend Vidya and her husband. And they asked why Kieran didn't come. And Vismaya starts explaining about the dowry issue, and her friend's advice is to stay and adapt to Kieran and his family. And again, this is a common concept in Indian society. The girl's supposed to go to the groom's house and adjust to their way of life and help them and live in the way that they want her to. But I don't think that's supposed to mean if she's being abused like this. So Vismaya goes on to explain more, and she says that Kieran has these crazy, unpredictable mood swings, that he's been beating her, and the worst is that Kieran sometimes doesn't sleep. when he doesn't sleep, she knows that he's going to beat her really badly the next day. She tells her friend that she has no affection for Kieran anymore, that he treats her like a sex toy, and her life has turned into a drama. And she even says that she can't love anymore. She also said that she felt she wasn't a suitable wife for Kieran since she hadn't brought him all the dowry he deserved. And I guess Vismaya was looking for help from her friend, and she didn't feel like her friend was giving it to her because her friend messaged her on June 18th, 2021, and Vismaya didn't answer. In June, again, there were the same conversations with her mother, and one new topic that came up was that apparently Vismaya was trying to get pregnant because she and Kieran apparently went to an infertility doctor who told them they were both fine and nothing was wrong. And I'm guessing that she was thinking that if she got pregnant and had a baby, the baby would fix this whole situation. Which, of course, we know that that's not how it works. And in another conversation, she and her mom are talking about how some celebrity is in the hospital in critical condition, and Vismaya says that that person is lucky. Clearly, she's having long-term suicidal ideation, but her mother's advice still was to adjust to her marital home. Vismaya also begged her mother to send her money to take her school exams, which she either couldn't or wouldn't do. And she told both Kieran and Dr. Revathi that she was suicidal, so now she's told several people that she's suicidal, but she's still being given this advice to stay in her situation. And later, her mother would even say that she always considered Kieran a fortunate thing that happened to Vismaya, and she really wanted them to stay married. But there are still more people that Vismaya was desperately reaching out to for help, and one of them was Kieran's own sister, Kirthi, who was living at the house with them. On June 13th, 2021, Vismaya sent Kirthi some really desperate messages, basically begging her to help her get back to her parents' house. She told Kirthi that she had nothing left and no money, and she was ready to leave Kieran and go home. Later on, Kirthi would claim that she went up to their room when she got these texts, but Vismaya said that she was just trying to prank her. On the night of June 20th, which was Father's Day, Kieran was once again beating Vismaya, and Vismaya actually asks him on WhatsApp why he's doing this, and she asks, "Is it because I didn't hand over the phone?" He had 2 missed calls from her, but apparently at some point he took her phone and hid it under a pillow from her. And this abuse that Kieran was giving her on this particular night was about all that Vismaya could handle. Because that night she went into the bathroom and ended her life. She was just 23 years old. Supposedly, Kieran went in and tried to resuscitate her, but was unable to. This is how Kieran's father remembers that night. "When I got up around 2:30 a.m. to use the toilet, I heard a sound from their room. My wife also woke up around the same time to use the toilet. Around 15 to 20 minutes later, we again heard some noise in their room, which is on the first floor. When we went to inquire, Vismaya said she wanted to go home. Kieran had withheld her phone, I think. We reassured her and said we could discuss that in the morning. We even said she could sleep in the other room on the ground floor. They sat together and discussed for some time and resolved the issue for the time being. We then went back to sleep." Now, when this case first happened, there was some speculation that this wasn't really a suicide. Instead, it was a murder. But according to the medical witnesses who testified, this was suicide. The next morning, someone told Vismaya's father that she was in the hospital in critical condition. This is what Vijith remembers about that day. "Doctors told us that my sister was brought to the hospital 2 hours after her death." 2 hours. None from Kiran Kumar's family informed us about her death. Instead, they told us that she was admitted in the private hospital in Sastamkota. Later, when I called the hospital to check on her condition, they informed me that she was brought dead there. This means that instead of calling the emergency number in India, which is 112, Kiran left Vismaya's body in the bathroom for 2 hours after she died. So, of course, Vismaya's parents show up at the hospital, and there they meet Kiran's father, who says that they had gotten into an altercation that night. Meanwhile, Kiran's cousin's wife comes to the hospital too, and she asks Kiran, "Have you now got your money and car?" To which he responds with open hands. Apparently, neither Kiran nor his family did anything to help with Vismaya's burial or to pay homage to her. They didn't visit Vismaya's parents' house, and they just left her parents to take care of all the funeral arrangements. And of course, at this point, the police want to know what is going on here. So Vismaya's father goes to the police station where they give him the car back because the car is still in his name. And he discovers that the AC knob and the information screen on the Yaris are both damaged, which is very interesting because this car is only a year old. The police went to Kiran's parents' house to do the investigation, and the person who was doing it was kind of new, and so she didn't gather some of the evidence that she should have. But it really didn't make a big difference in the case because they had all of this digital evidence, and they were able to piece together the story from that. So the police took Kiran's and Vismaya's and Kirti's phones to gather all the information from them. And that's when they found all of these voice recordings, and they played them for Vismaya's father, who was able to identify everyone in the recordings. They also found out that Kirti had deleted those WhatsApp messages that Vismaya had sent her. Now, you may be wondering what they could charge Kiran with, because this was a suicide and not a murder, technically. And this is actually a very interesting legal question around the world, which is, can a person actually compel another person to end their own life? And in India, because of the dowry issue, the answer is yes, they can. The prosecution charged Kiran with abetment of suicide, along with some other charges, and put him in jail. They took all of this evidence, all the WhatsApp chats, the phone calls that were recorded, they put all of them together and built this case against Kiran that basically he was harassing Vismaya so much and so badly and so often that she basically felt she had no choice other than to end her life in order to make her suffering from Kiran stop. Kiran's defense team, of course, made up a whole bunch of nonsense that I actually have a little bit of trouble following because it doesn't even make sense. So basically, they jumped all over the fact that Vismaya had done this on Father's Day, and they tried to make it seem like she had done this because of an ongoing conflict with her father. So they blamed him for all of this. They claimed that Vismaya had reached out to him and he didn't respond, which wasn't true. There was no evidence of that. They said that Vismaya's father was very powerful, which was why he was able to blame Kiran for all of this when it was actually his fault. Except that, in addition to being very powerful, Vismaya's father was also cursed, which meant that Vismaya couldn't get pregnant, and that was another thing that she was upset about. They said that her final school exams were the last straw, and all of these factors combined, which of course weren't related to Kiran, were why she decided to end her life. And just to clarify one point, Vismaya's father was a local political party leader, but I don't think he was that powerful at all. Another tidbit of this case is that Vismaya's father did notice that Vismaya hadn't changed her profile picture on WhatsApp to be one of her father, which she usually did on Father's Day. Kiran's defense team came up with another argument. So their argument was because Vismaya's father was so powerful, He basically orchestrated this entire conspiracy against him. So everything was a conspiracy. The evidence was fabricated, witnesses were planted, the police were against him. They tried to say that there was a suicide note that Kieran and his father had taken to the police, and they took this note away and told them never to mention it again, and they didn't know what happened to it. Because this was all part of the conspiracy against Kieran. And of course, they also added in that Vismaya was a very cunning trickster who was manipulating all of her friends and family into thinking that Kieran was abusive when he really wasn't, just to get sympathy from them. Basically, they came in and said, everything is fake news. But no one believed them, even though the defense's arguments were utter garbage. Vismaya's father, Thrivikraman, still had to come into court to be in the witness box for 4 days of the trial, which was really painful and difficult for him, especially when Kieran's defense attorney was cross-examining him. He said he felt like their questions were piercing through his heart. So no one bought these arguments from Kieran's defense, and the judge noted that Kieran had no remorse, and Vismaya would have had no reason to make any of this up. On May 24th, 2022, Kieran Kumar was found guilty of abetment of suicide and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was also found guilty on all the other charges, which also came with prison time, but the sentences were to run concurrently, meaning that he basically only got 10 years in prison. This was despite the fact that Kieran was claiming that he was the sole provider for the family, and his parents had all these medical problems and he needed to take care of them, but the judge did not grant him that much leniency for that. Kieran was also fined about $16,000, about $5,000 of which is supposed to go to Vismaya's parents. Vismaya's father said that he was satisfied with the ruling, but her mother said that she wanted to appeal because she wanted Kieran to go to prison for life. And of course, I'm sure Kieran will try to appeal his sentence, and only time will tell what will ultimately happen with that. The family has made at least a few media appearances. Thrivikraman says that the family's mistake was giving in to dowry in the first place, and that they should never have given any dowry. I want to deliver the message that he gave to the media for everyone to know. Thrivikraman Nair, father of Vismaya Nair, says that parents should not marry their daughters off to anyone who asks for dowry. They should only let their daughters marry boys who don't want anything other than to marry their daughter. He says that girls should study, get a job, and only then think about marriage, in that order. He says, what matters is our life, not what society thinks. And he also says, I am paying for my mistake, and I will suffer until I die. Now, in this interview, Vismaya's mother is sitting there and she doesn't say anything, but I'm willing to bet that she feels the same way. Thrivikraman says that he doesn't want any other parents to go through what he has. Today, Kieran Kumar lives in Block 5 of Pujapura Prison in Kerala. He actually works there as a gardener in the vegetable garden that they have there, and he gets breakfast, lunch, tea, and dinner, and he works from 7:15 a.m. to after 5 p.m. And he also makes 80 cents a day, which is going to increase to $1.60 per day once he's been doing this gardening job for a year. Maybe this is just because I really love gardening, but that just doesn't sound that bad to me. It's really amazing how quickly this happened. It was less than 2 years from the time that Vismaya got engaged to when she died. A lot of people have been asking why Vismaya was encouraged to stay with Kieran when all these people knew how bad the situation was and what was happening to her. And, this is a fair question, but at the same time, I think her parents and the other people who she told were just kind of in denial. I don't think that they really thought this was going to happen. I'm sure that if they had thought that, they would have taken different actions. They would have made some different choices. This is just pure speculation on my part, but I'm wondering if her parents were kind of worn out after they convinced Vismaya to get divorced and tried to facilitate that, and she ended up going back to Kieran. And maybe after that happened, they just felt like, well, we tried to help you and you wouldn't take it, so what are we going to do now? And I can understand if they felt that way, but it is very, very difficult to get out of an abusive relationship. There's a statistic that says it takes an average of 7 times, 7 tries, before a person will actually leave their abusive partner. I know it can be really frustrating when you're trying to help someone and they don't want to take your help, they won't take your advice, even though you both know it's good advice. But I think this should be a lesson to all of us to please be patient with anybody who's dealing with this situation. It's just something that requires a ton of patience and understanding. You know, right after this happened, Republic TV went to Vismaya's parents' house and they interviewed Vijith and his wife. And Vijith said that there was absolutely no way that Vismaya would end her own life. She was way too strong of a person and she had too much going for her. And I just think this speaks volumes about how soul destroying this was for Vismaya. Kieran's abuse just completely ruined her life. In just over a year of marriage, she went from being happy and joyful to living in complete and utter despair. And in a way, Vijith was not wrong, because it was Kieran who destroyed her life. Some people have commented on YouTube that this is all Vismaya's parents' fault, and if they had acted differently, none of this would have happened. And like I said earlier, I'm sure that they look back with regret. I mean, Trivikraman even went to the media and said that he has all this regret about the situation, and I bet her mom does too. But let's please try to be a little bit understanding here, because these people have lost their daughter. And I have heard and read that losing a child is about the worst thing that any person can go through. They're human too, and I'm sure that what they're suffering now is enough, and we don't need to all pile on that with a bunch of comments. And let's not forget about Kieran's parents, who were right there watching their son torture and beat his wife on a daily basis. They saw this constantly. They let this go on in their house and apparently said nothing to Kieran, didn't even try to get him to stop. I'm sure that there are plenty of lessons to go around here, but that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you next time.